It was late evening on a chilly Friday when Marcus Johnson, a well-respected black attorney who had spent years fighting for justice in courtrooms across the country, found himself on the wrong side of the law for the first time in his life. Not because he had broken any law, but because three officers in a small-town police department saw him as nothing more than a stereotype the moment he stepped out of his luxury car. Marcus had been on his way back from a long drive, dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie, when the flashing red and blue lights suddenly appeared in his rearview mirror. He pulled over calmly, but what followed was anything but routine. The officers swaggered up to his window, smirking, making comments under their breath about another thug in an expensive car. And before Marcus could explain that he was a practicing attorney with identification to prove it, one officer yanked, opened the door, and dragged him out. They slammed him against the hood, cuffed him tightly, and laughed in his face as bystanders on the sidewalk looked on, some filming with their phones. "What's the matter, big man? Not used to being on the other side of the law?" one sneered, while another mocked his protests, saying, "Oh, I'm sure you're a lawyer, buddy, and I'm the President of the United States." The humiliation cut deep, but Marcus remained calm, knowing that any anger would only give them more excuses. They shoved him into the back of the cruiser, chuckling among themselves about how the jailhouse was gonna love this guy. That night, Marcus sat in a holding cell, treated with disdain, denied even the courtesy of a phone call until hours later. But what the officers didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that Marcus was not only an attorney, he had recently been appointed as a judge in the very district these officers served, with his official swearing-in scheduled to take place the following week. The irony burned inside him as he sat behind bars, replaying their laughter and insults. The entire arrest had been unlawful, driven by prejudice and arrogance, and Marcus knew justice would come. He just didn't expect how soon the tables would turn, because by the next morning his calendar already had him presiding over cases, and fate had arranged for the very first defendants to be the same officers who mocked him only hours earlier. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the tall courthouse windows as Marcus adjusted his crisp black robe, his heart steady, but his mind replaying the events of the night before with every breath. The courtroom was packed, reporters lingering outside because word had already spread that a new judge was presiding today, but no one knew the storm about to unfold. As the bailiff called the first case, the heavy double doors opened, and in shuffled the three officers, their confident swagger now replaced by confusion at seeing Marcus seated high on the bench, gavel in hand, eyes sharp with authority. They froze mid-step, one of them audibly whispering, "No way! It can't be him!" The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Marcus looked directly at them, his face calm but carrying the weight of last night's injustice. "Case of misconduct and unlawful arrest by officers Daniels, Miller, and Price," the clerk announced, her voice echoing in the tense silence. Marcus let the moment hang, the irony thick in the air before speaking in his deep, commanding tone. "Gentlemen, you stand accused of violating the very laws you swore to uphold. Do you recognize this courtroom? Do you recognize me?" Their faces drained of color, sweat forming at their brows, as the realization hit them like a tidal wave. The same man they had mocked, cuffed, and laughed at was now the one who would determine their fate. Gasps and whispers rippled through the room, reporters scribbling furiously, every pair of eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. Marcus allowed himself no smirk, no outward satisfaction, only the cold delivery of justice. "Last night, you believed you had power over me. Today, you will learn the true meaning of accountability." One officer stammered, "Your Honor, we didn't know," but Marcus cut him off sharply. "The law does not bend for ignorance, officer. It demands fairness, and fairness begins with responsibility." The courtroom held its breath, sensing that this was not just another trial. It was history in the making, a reckoning for arrogance and racism laid bare in front of the world. The trial began with evidence that painted an undeniable picture of abuse of power. The arrest footage from bystanders, the body cam recordings reluctantly submitted by the department, and witness testimonies from people who saw Marcus pulled from his car without cause. Every clip replayed the officers' mocking laughter, their crude remarks, their absolute disregard for law and dignity. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as their behavior, once hidden under the badge, was now projected on a screen larger than life. Marcus, though personally wronged, conducted the proceedings with unwavering professionalism, never once raising his voice, but his questions cut sharper than any blade. "Officer Daniels," he said coolly, "why did you fail to read me my rights?" The man fumbled, muttering excuses about procedure, while the video clearly showed his mocking grin instead of any Miranda warning. "Officer Miller," Marcus pressed, "how do you justify laughing while placing a citizen under arrest without probable cause?" The officer stuttered, sweating under the gaze of the gallery. And Officer Price, who had been the loudest in ridiculing Marcus, now sat hunched and broken, whispering answers that contradicted his own reports. But just as the walls were closing in on them, the defense attorney tried a desperate move, suggesting that Marcus should recuse himself due to personal involvement. The room tensed, the possibility of Marcus stepping aside hanging heavy in the air. But then the senior judge of the circuit, who had been observing quietly from chambers, entered and declared that Marcus had full authority to continue, since this case was not about revenge, but about officers already under investigation for repeated misconduct. The arrest of Marcus was merely the tipping point that exposed years of corruption. Gasps filled the room, reporters nearly tripping over themselves to get the breaking news out. These officers weren't just guilty of one unlawful arrest. They had a long trail of complaints buried by the department. The twist deepened. The stakes grew higher, and the once smug officers now realized they weren't just fighting to keep their jobs. They were fighting to stay out of prison. The final day of the trial arrived, and the courthouse was overflowing, every seat taken, the hallway lined with cameras and citizens who had once feared speaking against the police, but now found courage in watching justice unfold. Marcus entered in silence, his robe flowing behind him, the gavel heavy in his hand, yet his eyes calm as stone. The officers sat at the defense table, no longer in uniform, stripped of the authority they once abused, their faces pale, hollow, and trembling with the weight of what was coming. Marcus spoke slowly, his words echoing with the gravity of history. "Last night, you treated me like a criminal because of the color of my skin, not because of the content of my actions. You laughed while breaking the law, and you mocked the very system you swore to defend. Today, you will learn that justice is not a costume you wear, but a principle that governs us all." The courtroom was silent, except for the scratching of pens and the whir of cameras, every word destined to echo beyond these walls. He reviewed the evidence, cited the misconduct, the abuse of power, the prior complaints deliberately hidden by their department, and finally delivered the blow that would end their careers forever. "This court finds you guilty of unlawful arrest, abuse of authority, and misconduct unbecoming of law enforcement officers. You are hereby sentenced to immediate dismissal from duty and remanded for sentencing on charges of civil rights violations." Gasps filled the room, some clapping, others crying, as the three officers bowed their heads in shame, the weight of justice crashing down on them like the very bars they had once used to cage others. Marcus paused, then spoke one final line, not as a victim, but as a judge. "Last night you laughed at me. Today, justice laughs at you." The gavel struck, the courtroom erupted, and across the nation headlines blazed the story of the black man who had been mocked in handcuffs only to rise the very next day as the judge who turned humiliation into history. It was more than a verdict. It was a message, a reminder that no matter how dark the night, the morning always brings light. and no laughter built on injustice ever lasts long.